Hello, I'm Jim Cuno, president of the J. Paul Getty Trust. Welcome to Art and Ideas, a podcast in which I speak to artists, conservators, authors, and scholars about their work.
He was always about the particular. This particular shape, this particular form, this particular color, everything is completely unique and particular.
In this episode, I speak with art historian Yve-Alain Bois about the artist Ellsworth Kelly. The great American painter Ellsworth Kelly died on December 27, 2015. I first met Ellsworth in 1989 when, as director of Dartmouth's Hood Museum of Art, we hosted a retrospective exhibition of his prints. He was instantly charming, friendly, and giving of his time. 2 years later, when I became director of the Harvard University Art Museums, I called Ellsworth with questions about how we might best conserve an outdoor sculpture of his that had been damaged from years of exposure to New England's harsh winters. The work was a red and blue sculpture that he'd exhibited on the U.S. Pavilion for the 1964 World's Fair in New York City. He responded to my question by saying that he'd rarely done multicolored sculpture, and he'd never really been very happy with the Harvard one, and if we were going to work on it anyway, why didn't we have it painted white? Then in 1993, Ellsworth gave the Harvard Museums a vertical sculpture made in 1974 of weathering steel entitled Curve 10. He gave it in honor of the great collector and Harvard benefactor, Joseph Pulitzer, Jr. When Ellsworth saw the sculpture installed in the museum, it had rust marks on its surface, which I took to be natural to weathered steel. It wasn't, not to Ellsworth. As he hadn't yet actually given it to us, he took it back and reworked it to look brand new, with a glass bead-blasted surface like the sculptures he was making in the 1990s. 11 years later, as director of the Art Institute of Chicago, I commissioned Ellsworth to make a large white fan sculpture for a wall of the garden in the Renzo Piano-designed modern wing. I imagined that it would have a matte surface, like all of Ellsworth's sculptures I'd known, but when it came off the truck, it had a glossy surface, and it beautifully reflected the dappled colors of the garden's plantings. When I asked him about it, he said simply, "Well, I'm not interested in matte surfaces anymore." 3 sculptures, 3 experiences with Ellsworth, each one an instance of his renewing, or in one case his wanting to renew, his past sculptural practice in the manner in which he was then now working. Ellsworth had a restless and curious mind, up until the day he died at age 92. When I called him some months before, I asked how he was, and he said he'd been in the studio working. I said, thinking it was funny, "What color were you working on?" And he said he hadn't yet gotten to the color. He'd been putting ground on his canvases. That was Ellsworth, a celebrated artist in every medium, with new commissions for sculpture on 3 continents, and 5 exhibitions in New York alone to mark his 90th birthday, still putting ground on his canvases himself, because that was central to his painting practice. As in his sculptures, his paintings were as much about their quality of surface as they were about their shape, size, and color. For Ellsworth, every new work was a new adventure, a new way of working, a new way of making things of extraordinary visual delight. Ellsworth lived to see published the first volume of his catalogue raisonné, the authoritative account of his career, to be published in 6 volumes by Cahiers d'Art, the famous publisher of Picasso's catalogue raisonné, and written by the eminent modernist art historian Yve-Alain Bois, professor of art history in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. I've known Yve-Alain as a friend and colleague for many years, and I recently called him to talk about Ellsworth and the catalogue raisonné, and I started by asking, just how involved was Ellsworth in the preparation of the catalogue?
Because he was interested in his legacy, and he was an extraordinary artist. So when working on the chronology, which sometimes was a little fuzzy in his mind, he would nevertheless recall a particular detail that would bring a particular sketch, and from that particular sketch, it would bring another particular sketch, and then he would always go this way. It would be kind of like a strange labyrinth in which, in the end, you would reconstruct the whole thing. Sometimes, of course, we disagreed on certain things, but not much. I mean, it was just a matter of little details, like he would be absolutely sure that he had done that thing in November 51, and I would demonstrate it would not be possible. And so, okay. I would find documents that contradicted his memory, but it didn't happen very, very often. So it was just a matter of checking things or double checking things. And he was, of course, very interested in the way I would dig more about all these years in France. I must admit that when I started the catalogue raisonné, I'd already worked quite a lot on those French years. First with this text I wrote, which was the beginning of my investment in Kelly, for the exhibition about his French years at the Jeux de Paume in Paris and National Gallery in Washington, and then later on at the Sackler. When you were there for that show, we mounted together on Ellsworth Kelly's drawings and collages from this period. I worked quite a lot on the French years of Kelly, and so I thought, well, it's okay, this is a little piece of cake, I'm going to do that in 2 minutes. Well, not at all, because working more and discovering more of his archive and more things that I didn't know, I realized how much I didn't know and how rewarding it would be to dig further. And so the whole structure of the catalogue actually changed. I had thought of writing normal, fairly short entries for each work, and then a very long monographic introduction, so to speak, or maybe even just a short introduction, but then a big book at the end that would be one particular volume. And I just had to change because there was so much that I was discovering on those works that I realized it's silly not to expand on the works themselves. And so there would be no monography at the end, no independent monograph, and there would be no big introduction. There would be these sometimes very, very elaborate entries, some of the manuscript of which are, it was 20-page long. So.
Yeah, they're essay-like.
Yeah, each work has an essay. So the early works, when you're a student, it's very short, but some of the entries, as I said, like for the window or for major important, really important works, turning points in his career, some of the entries are very, very long.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to that, both about the structure of the book and about Ellsworth's uncanny obsession with his past and his ability to gather from his archive things that you needed to have at hand. But I want to get back to the question of Cahiers d'Art itself.
Yeah.
People may not know that Cahiers d'Art was a Paris-based arts magazine and publishing enterprise funded by Zervos, Christian Zervos, in 1926. And it was a serious journal of art and ideas with articles written by, for example, Paul Eluard, Samuel Beckett, Jacques Lacan, and others, and with reproduction of works by artists such as Picasso, Matisse, Leger, Ernst, Brancusi, Calder, Duchamp. It was a big deal. It also published the famous 33-volume catalogue raisonné of the works of Picasso, compiled by Zervos and published over 46 years from 1932 to 78. Ellsworth lived in Paris, obviously, from 48 to 53, so he lived in the era of Cahiers d'Art. Did he ever meet Zervos?
I don't know if he met Zervos, but he met his publications. He was given very early on one of the publications of, I think when he arrived in Paris, or just a year after, one of the early publications by Zervos on Greek Cycladic art, published by Morancé, I think. And, he still has, this volume is still in his library. And he also purchased, I don't know when exactly, probably not until the 60s, the Zervos catalogue raisonné. It's in the library.
The Picasso.
The Picasso, yeah.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of having the book published by Cahiers d'Art happened a little by chance. Stefan Ehrenberg decided to resuscitate Cahiers d'Art, which had basically stopped any activity after the end of the Picasso catalogue raisonné. They were not doing anything. So he bought this company and decided to start again the journal. His idea was to do the first special issue. The first issue would be a special issue on Ellsworth. So he went to see Ellsworth. And we had not decided who would be the actual publisher of the catalogue raisonné of Ellsworth. Our idea was more like, has been in many other enterprise of the same kind, which is that the foundation of the artist is actually the real publisher, and there is a distributor which pretends to be a publisher, like Yale did for Rothko, which was completely done by the National Gallery and the Rothko Foundation, or Yale did for Barnett Newman, which was completely done by the Barnett Newman Foundation, and so forth. So we thought it was going to be that model. But, Ehrenberg had to say, well, why not me? And then he said something which was so extraordinary that I told Ellsworth, you are not going to hear that very often. He said, as long as you want, you can have as many supporting illustrations as you want. Every single work on which there's an entry will be produced in color, full page. I mean, it was just like insane. And you never heard a publisher doing that. It's like, I told Ellsworth, this is not what you hear. I can tell you, this is not common.
Yeah. Well, tell us what is a catalogue raisonné, what function it will serve for scholars in the future.
Well, catalogue raisonné usually is just the tombstone, as they call it, but the identity card of each work. What titles did it get? When it was first shown? When it was first commented? Kind of bibliography, exhibition history, provenance, and all that. That's what a catalogue raisonné usually has. But I found myself often frustrated that it's not more raisonné. That it's often just, the catalogue raisonné of Zervosig is a typical example. It's just an accumulation of photographs with a title at the end, a list of titles and dates at the end of the book. And it's very unsatisfying there's no real reasoning there. And so I always dreamt of a catalogue raisonné that would have real serious discussion of the works. And in the case of the first volume, because especially when from 48 to 53, when Ellsworth works in Paris, he works in 54 too, but he doesn't paint in 54. So that there's no work from 54 in that first volume. But during this period, it's really when he invents himself, and really almost every new painting or relief, there's no sculpture yet, is a completely new departure. He really invents so many things and so fast during this period that almost every entry is a kind of little mini essay on a new problem, if not a new problem, a new solution. There's very, very few entries that are more than one work. I think that the second volume will start being quite different than that, because when he comes to New York, also starts working more in series. And so I think that in that particular first volume, there's maybe 5 entries that are on more than one work. I think that in the second volume, it will be half and half. And I think in the third volume, proportion would be reversed. It would be very few entries on just one work. I'm not going to write a new essay on each possible curve of each totem that he made, because I'm not Superman. But because the problem doesn't change so much from one totem to the next, let's say. But in France, during those years, that's which he really invents himself, and the speed at which he does it. It's constantly in the letters he writes to his friends. I don't have the time to finish on my ideas. I don't have, he's constantly late on his own, brilliance, which is also why this period he always characterized this period as the most important period of his production, as the most happy period of his life, even though he was a loner and didn't have a huge, circle of friends in Paris. And so it's also why he knows so much about this period, because I think right from the start, he was quite conscious that what he was doing was new. And I think that particularly when John Copland started working on him, and the Copland's article on Kelly's French years appeared in Art Forum in the summer of '69, and was very, very striking to everyone, because people didn't know then about this work. I think that around that time, let's say in 68, 69, 68 is when he gives to MoMA a painting for a large wall also. So he started paying a lot more attention to his early work and started archiving it in a more logistic manner and so forth, and looking a lot at his early drawings and sketchbooks and, mining his own work and reminiscing. So he has been thinking about his early work with more focus since 68, 69, when Copland started to work on him.
So we talked a little bit earlier about his obsessive preoccupation with his early work. It is staggering that he kept so much of it and took care of it so well over those difficult years, those first years, and that it would be available to you. I think that you said something that there were just 2 paintings that you've lost track of. Otherwise all that production is known, and its current location is known. And
that's one of the great things about is there will not be production of fakes. At least in terms of paintings, reliefs, and sculpture, that will not happen. It can't. It's just impossible.
I remember once being with you in the studio, and you're teasing Ellsworth over a postcard that you had written as maybe a teenager. You had something to say on the postcard about a painting of his you'd seen, and you didn't like some aspect of it or something, and you were teasing him that he didn't reply. He hadn't replied to you and your postcard, and he rushed back to his archive and pulled the postcard out of the archive and brought it to you and said, "You didn't put on a return address."
The thing, I have to correct the story, actually, because I said that story actually I mentioned it several times. And just 2 days before he died, I actually by pure chance, I was trying to find the date of the 50th trips I made in New York to try to find out what the first time I saw was another work of art. It was called Hearts Beats Dust by Jean Dupuy. I wanted to find out exactly, because I knew I saw it in New York and I knew I saw it in the gallery, but I couldn't find exactly which trip. So I was looking at a whole bunch of letters that I wrote to people, and for whatever reason, in a bunch of letters from Mario Shapiro, I found this postcard from Ellsworth, and in fact, he had answered me. I was like him. So it was just 2 days before he died, and I almost called him. I'm glad I didn't, because I thought maybe I would like feel, oh my God, I killed him. I was totally flabbergasted. I was like, this is really, really weird. So he had answered me, and what I'd written to him was a letter, not a postcard, but it was pure drivel. I'm glad he found it, because he never threw anything away. But and he gave me a copy, which immediately I lost. But anyway.
but tell us more about your thoughts of the sort of psychology of the person to keep such things, because every note he took, every sketch he made, every collage he made, at a time in which he was fairly impoverished and busily working away, he found some way to keep care of things.
Yeah, it took him a while to get back his the works. I don't know exactly if he took with him his sketchbooks, but certainly the painting and sculpture, he had to have a deal, and he paid, and it took him a lot to pay with the Cunard, a transatlantic, liner. It took him 5 years, even though he was indeed very poor. I think it relates to another topic, which is this capacity that he has, as you mentioned in the beginning, I take just example of the last exhibition which is last year actually, at Matthew Mark's gallery, which some of the works were based on collage that he made in the 50s and 60s. And unlike any other artist that I know of, when he decides to realize in painting a final collage, final study for work that he had done before, it doesn't make any difference that he could have done it in 1958 as a painting, but he didn't, because he always ran out of time with regard to his ideas. So he goes back to it 50 years later, says, I didn't do that, I could do it, that's interesting. No. It has to be exact. He reproduces exactly the collage to the scale of a painting. He doesn't allow himself to edit whatsoever. And it's the same idea when he does this thing which is called a transfer, when he records a surface that he sees in the world, something that has to be flat, and he just records it as a Chinese archaeologist would move frottage on old Chinese tombs or whatever. It's just a matter of recording without interpretation, without editorial decisions. And when he finds the ice cream cone flattened in the street and he likes the shape that it makes, the first thing he does is paste it in some piece of paper to keep it. And then eventually, a few days or weeks or months later, or even years later, he said, I should realize it was perfect. I like it at first, and I was right to like it. It's exactly what I want to do. He would do it exactly. He would recopy. He would just trace the exact proportion and just expand it on a shaped canvas. That's all he would do. Nothing would be added to the shape that struck him at first. And the idea that a collage by him or something that he finds in the world and records as such, it's the same. There is no difference for him. There is no personal, subjective added value of the fact that one comes from a doodle that he made and the other one something found in the street. The subjective act is just the choice. This is something that befell on me. I don't know why I like it, but I like it, and I'm going to do it. That I find amazing, because I don't know if there's any other artist who would be able to look at one's own work from 10, 20, 30, 50 years before without wanting to, if you want to realize something from a drawing to a painting, without wanting to change it. That's really unique. I don't know any other artist like that. So his past has always been a kind of cornucopia from which he could select things at any time. He never abandoned anything. He was very critical of his own work, and sometimes there are works that he didn't like. In general, it was the works that he kind of tended to discard were works that were too much historically bound. Like there's all series of work that he made in the late 60s that had to do with some kind of optical illusion of, false perspectival views, and he never liked them. Or when based on the kind of isometrical cube, he never liked those things. He liked them when he made them, but he never liked them during the time I was friends with him for the last.
Did he destroy work? So did he constantly edit his oeuvre?
He destroyed work, but far less than one would think. In fact, certainly he had a very hard time destroying paintings. He didn't like to destroy things, even if he didn't like the work. He destroyed some drawings, yes, but far less than what would think. He didn't like to show. Like when I did a show, I did at a drawing center, of the tablet. So one day I was at Ellsworth's studio, and he said, he opened a big drawer and said, "Yve-Alain, did I show you those?" And of course, he knew very well he had never showed me those. Those were about 200 boards on cardboard with all kinds of little drawings, but also clips of images cut out from magazines and all that were glued on these 200 cardboards. And they were basically things that he had to. They were in a big box when he was moving from New York to Princeton, and he decided, okay, well, they were not good enough to be in sketchbooks, but they were not bad enough to be thrown away, so I had to find something. So he just made this presentation for him to keep them. And he had never shown it to anyone, and he had never looked at them, really, that time. And I said, well, we have to show them. And he was very ambivalent about the idea of showing them, because they were rough ideas. There were some doodles that he made without paying any attention to it. It took him a while. We showed it, and until the end, he had a very ambivalent relationship to the show. It shows my weakness and all. But he has this idea. I remember one month that Picasso never made a bad drawing. Said, well, Ellsworth, I will. I'm sure we have the servers here. I'll show you quite a few bad ones if you want to. So, but he could not bring himself to throw away all these things in this box of little clippings, of little doodle.
From almost from the very beginning. I mean, the words you use, I think the phrase that you use, which is so clear in this, is that you say the habit of harnessing his own past without succumbing to the habit of editing it.
I came to understand that Ellsworth is not an abstract artist, at least to the way we understand abstraction, which has often to do with universal. Speak about Mondrian, like against a particular, go behind the appearances to the core or whatever. He was always about the particular, the completely particular. This particular shape, this particular form, this particular color, everything is completely unique and particular, which is why he can't edit. Because editing would mean that there's a kind of core behind the particularity. That there is some kind of central image that is behind the material, rendering of. For him, it's that square and not that one. At the end of the catalogue raisonné, I allude to that thing which I think absolutely wonderful, which is one of the two last works he made in Paris, where a pair of a white square bordered by a black frame and a black square bordered by white frame. Now, those works have been often compared to Malevich, but in fact, in the reverse. For Malevich, there was the black square, but the black square could come in any way. He had several versions of the same painting, some done by a student. He had even a plate. It was on his tomb. I mean, the black square was a kind of universal thing for Malevich, like the 0 degree of shape. It was like the beginning of everything and the end of everything. Before Ellsworth, the square was not this kind of universal shape at all. In fact, those paintings were linked to a frosted glass screen of a cafe with a metal frame of a cafe terrace in Paris that you would put in a fall. And he went back to measure the square. And he says something in one of the texts that he wrote, or interview with someone. He says, I had to measure the proportion of the square, but it's not the proportion I told also. Square has very clear proportion, it's 1-to-1. It's the size. This particular size is what he liked. This particular measurement of this particular square. It's not just a square, it's that square. And that's, I think, is typical of the way he thought.
You also say at one point about, in his working pattern, you describe it as a system, and then almost immediately you backtrack and say the idea of a system is inadequate when talking about his work, that it doesn't admit to Ellsworth's habit of working intuitively. Yeah,
it's true.
What do you mean by that, and how do you rethink the word system?
He had no, let's say, theoretical foundation, really. He had a practical tools of being taught simply the manipulation of color and paint and at the school. But he had no, today's young kids who go to art school, they are spoon-fed a lot of theoretical discourse. not at all with Ellsworth. It's completely intuitive, and sometimes he doesn't quite know what he's doing until much later. He reflects upon it, but it's kind of after. So I think it's all that's what I call is non-compositional strategies. They just came kind of naturally, organically, without him really thinking too much about it. And with regard to color, often he's asked, what did you do? How do you explain why you use this color? He often said, I don't know. And he had this wonderful image of, I don't know what's the word in English, the people who look for springs or water, and in the south of France, they have these little rods, they hold it, and when the rod starts trembling, there must be water underneath there. He made often this gesture, I don't know, it's like that, and he would do the same gesture with his hands, I do that. My brain does that, so my eyes do that. He always said, my eyes tell me, that's it, but I don't know why exactly. And he would agonize about a particular shade of one color for months. In the last show, there was one painting, three-panel painting with red, black, and white. And for more than a year, that painting was unfinished it looked finished to me, but it was actually declared unfinished in the studio. Every time I would come, let's say every month or a month and a half, and he was dissatisfied with the red, and he would change the red. And of course, since I would go only every month and a half or something, I frankly could not see much difference. But for him, it was absolutely And one day he said, "Okay, I found the red. That's it. I got it." But he was not. He had no particular idea of why exactly, and he really disliked any kind of color theory. And I had a hard time explaining to him that Albert didn't have a theory. He disliked Albert's theory of color. I said, "But Albert is not it's practical recipes. There's no real theory." But he was like, that was it.
Now you cite some factors to be taken into consideration when considering his non-compositional strategy, as you call it, and some of these factors, you say, are his early interest in medieval and particularly Romanesque sculpture or architecture, the impact of Hiroshima and the atom bomb on the artist's sense of self and humanity, big questions, the overwhelming presence and example, of course, of Picasso as a young artist for Ellsworth working in Paris after the war. What about these factors? And you can tell us more about them.
Well, I don't, when around his first statements, the famous letter to Cage, where he spoke about the anonymity of the medieval period, and that was a kind of romantic view of the Middle Age and the pre-modern concept, pre-Renaissance even concept of the artist that he had. So he was interested in that, but I would say as a kind of dream, a kind of dreamland.
You raised the name of John Cage. And you do talk about the role of chance in his non-compositional strategy. And some of that comes from or is introduced to him by Ralph Coburn, as I recall. Could you tell us more about the role of chance in his work?
Yeah. So, I try to correct a mistake that is often done, that Cage was very important for Kelly with regard to this issue of chance. Cage they met for one afternoon in June 1949 and another afternoon, I think 2 weeks later. And that was it. And then they corresponded. Kelly wrote to him a year and a half later. So at that time, Cage was not interested in chance, not yet. So Cage was very, very important for Kelly in the sense that Kelly was very young, very shy, and Cage told him, "Oh, what you do is very good," because he brought him to his hotel room. They were in the same. They met because they were in the same hotel, and Coburn was Kelly's friend. Just say, "Oh, it's Cage here," and introduced. The introductions were made and whatever. But so chance. Coburn indeed had Coburn and also Jungermann a bit later had introduced Kelly to the game of the cadaveric ski, which Kelly found interesting, but was not sure it could yield too much, and didn't actually continue on that. The person that was important for him with regard to his interest in chance was actually Jean Arp, which he visited 3 times in 1950 and 1951, and Arp showed them. He went with Coburn, and in one visit with Jungermann, Arp showed them a little collage he had made of things cut out and or torn out, and that's what Arp said. I never believed completely that, but arranged according to chance by throwing the piece of paper on the ground and then glue them on a piece of paper as they had fallen. So that had been important for Kelly as a kind of, and also the fact that what Arp had been doing is cutting up his own work as a kind of almost iconoclastic relationship to his previous work. So in order to make those collage according to chance. And that was important for Kelly. It was a big, that's one way to use it. And he began to be more interested in the whole.
And we see Ellsworth use that in 1951 in Cité, for example, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So we mentioned Coburn and you mentioned Jack Youngerman.
Yeah.
Those are pretty much Ellsworth's friends at the time. He was pretty much otherwise alone, wasn't he? And
Jack Youngerman and his wife, Delphine Seyrig, the actress Delphine Seyrig. Ellsworth he was lonely. I mean, even though he had a show in Paris in a gallery that he himself and Jack Youngerman and a third friend, Koskas, persuade this bookseller, Arnaud, to open a kind of gallery in the basement. And so they spent like 2.5 or 3 months basically painting, cleaning, whatever the basement. And then they each of them had a show there. And it was his first one-man show, which is quite amazing, including, major works. And, he didn't sell anything. The only work that he sold in Paris was actually before that show, and was through the friendship. It was to Henri Seyrig, the father of Delphine Seyrig. And Henri Seyrig was the head of Oriental antiquity in the Louvre at the time. He was a major scholar, and he was also the head of the French Institute of Archaeology in Lebanon. And so anyways, that's the only work that Ellsworth sold in 5 years and a half of being in Paris. Just extraordinary.
But the advantage to him, and we talked about this a bit earlier, the advantage of him being away from New York and away from the pressure of New York, the towering figures of New York, the emergence of a Picasso-like figure, Pollock, in New York, ultimately was to his advantage.
Yeah, but he didn't know it at the time. When he came back to New York, he felt that he had missed the boat a bit, and people thought he was too European in a way. And he was a very strange situation, because in Paris he was always thought as too American, partly because he didn't speak French very well, or almost not. And when he returned to America, he was fed as his work was understood as too European. So he was a bit of a little off. He was a little, a loner, it's true, and never felt that he belonged to any group or anything. Even late in life, I mean, the artists that with whom he associated you would not imagine being part of the same group. Let's say that he was always very, very fond of Roy Lichtenstein. They even showed together, but you would not necessarily put them in the same, in the same branch of the tree. Let's say. So
in those last months, let's say in Paris. He was in the hospital for some number of weeks. He wasn't feeling well. He was at the American Hospital in Neuilly. And he came across, you say, in the catalogue, you say he comes across this article on the work of Ad Reinhardt. And that was important to him. Yeah, well, he saw the cover of Art News. I think it was out in a review of the show of Reinhardt, a long review. And he said, oh, my God, remember, he was very poor. He had not sold anything. He was very depressed at the time because he had been kicked out of his studio by the owner who could rent it to an artist who was more fortunate. So he was very depressed, and I was beginning to write to friends. That's it. I have to go back. I can't continue anymore. And he felt that if those works by Reinhardt, they were like probably I don't remember the cover, but I think it was a blue. No, it was not a black work. It was one of those blue, monochrome, but not monochrome because there's no monochrome in Reinhardt, but blue on blue, and. He felt, if there's like a color in the cover of a journal and an article, then maybe I can survive in America. Maybe my kind of work can sell. So that he came back. So Yve-Alain, we talked earlier about how long you've been thinking about and looking at and writing about Ellsworth's work over the course of your academic career, scholarly career. And then in the intensity of this project with years, a decade or so on this first volume of the catalogue raisonné, how much did you learn in the process? I mean, you mentioned earlier about something about how you learned about his working process at the beginning, but is a fundamental change in your thinking about him as a result of this long-term commitment to the project? It's hard to say. For the most part, my interpretation or my vision of things didn't change, but it got deeper. I was a bit afraid, to tell you the truth, about this first volume. For one reason, it's always a difficult volume because it's a volume where you establish the grade, basically the parameter, how to work, how to do. You have to put the structure in place. So it's a bit scary for that. But that was not the main problem for me. I was afraid of getting bored because I thought I knew those works very well. I'd written about almost all of them before, and
On the contrary, what happened is that I would get more and more impressed by the process and all the visual thinking that was behind every one of them, even much more than I'd previously thought, because I just spent more time with all of them, and discovered things that I didn't know before, or a lot of things that I didn't know before. So my interpretation or my view of Ellsworth has not changed, except that I think that I would not have said before, it would not have been in my DNA to say that I didn't think that Ellsworth is an abstract artist, at least on the way. I mean, he is an abstract artist, of course, but he doesn't have any concept of the universal, and so which is the way we think about abstraction, which is like, you have all the concrete part and then you have the abstract concept that is not. I don't think I would have been able to formulate it that way. I think that the notion that everything is utterly particular and not can't be reproduced in any other way, that is something that I understood intuitively but could not have formulated that way. That's true.
Yve-Alain, thank you so much for all the time that you've given us. I've got one last question.
Okay.
It was something that I teased you with before we got on the air. But one of the fundamental and profound contributions that a catalogue raisonné makes is to the authority that it has. And that authority is usually referred to in shorthand by the name of the author and the number given with the work of art thereafter. So from here on out, Ellsworth forever is going to be, his pictures will be referred to by Bois numbers. How do you live with that?
I don't know. Until a friend of mine mentioned that to me yesterday, I had never thought about it. It's a bit, I don't know. I don't know what to think about it. I really don't.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. It's been great talking with you.
All right.
Our theme music comes from the Dharma at Big Sur, composed by John Adams for the opening of the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles in 2003. Look for new episodes of Art and Ideas every other Wednesday. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud, or visit getty.edu/podcasts for more resources. Thanks for listening.